As I understand, King Alfred, your name is not spoken with affection here in Mercia.
Yet I am close enough to Wessex to hear myself praised from morn till twilight.
Return to your singing subjects then, and leave the affairs of Mercia to the Danes.
Not till your pagan war songs are safely out of hearing.
So many of you would have seen Anglo-Saxon trending on Twitter. I think it was Friday or Thursday last week. And I saw it trending and I was like, you know, has a new Viking series been announced? DLC for Assassin's Creed or something? Well, it turns out some of the most nutty and far-right members of the Republican Party were making a new America First Caucus talking about having Anglo-Saxon political traditions. Now, as an English person, this struck me as very strange because, of course, we're taught about the Anglo-Saxons from a young age. And most people in this country know what that is, but it's not a term in wide use in the UK. Unless you're just like an insanely old-school, bigoted person, most people don't talk about this stuff anymore. But in America, it has been a thing. If any of you have studied books like The Great Gatsby, you may have looked at WASPs, which stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and looked at their culture, because The Great Gatsby as a book is examining this culture. But what we're going to do in this video is talk about the America First Caucus, talk about what they say these traditions are. Then we're going to get into how Anglo-Saxon is often just a racist dog whistle, particularly in America. Then we're going to talk about the history of the Anglo-Saxons to describe how ridiculous it is that racists often use these guys as sort of something to aspire to be, like they're a very homogenous group. And then we're going to talk about the battle over the term Anglo-Saxon, because there's a very interesting drama with history as an academic study. I did my degree in history, so I'm very passionate about this stuff. But it's about the field of Anglo-Saxon history and how historically it's been used to push racism. And it's talking about whether this term is still appropriate. If you want to support my work continuing for the future, regardless of what YouTube do, please consider becoming a patron. If you want to join our growing community, please check out the Discord and the subreddit in the description. And if you want to follow me personally, check out @the_Kavernacle on Instagram and Twitter. And also u/TommyCahill1995 for my personal Reddit. Now, I touched on this last week, but thank you everyone so much for the 30k subscribers. For every 5k, we get a new chocolate orange. So 35, that is the next target. So please help me get there and build the pyramid even higher. For those of you who want it, there is a second channel called the Kavernacle Extra where I put all my archived streams, so go check that out if you want to. But I thought I'd start off with what gave me the idea for this video, and of course I already mentioned it, but let's get into Vice's coverage of the story. So Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz launch Anglo-Saxon America First Caucus. A group of the House's most extreme right-wing Republicans is launching a new caucus to push President Trump's values. So they also said they have an explicit pledge to push Anglo-Saxon political traditions. So scandal-plagued Florida GOP rep Matt Gaetz announced he was joining Marjorie Taylor Greene's new America First Caucus group on Friday, just hours after a draft memo leaked that outlined the organization's barely veiled racism. The 7-page memo states the group has been formed to follow in President Trump's footsteps and potentially step on some toes and sacrifice sacred cows for the good of the American nation. America is a nation with a border, a culture strengthened by a common respect for uniquely Anglo-Saxon political traditions, the memo reads. History has shown that societal trust and political unity are threatened when foreign citizens are imported en masse into a country, particularly without institutional support for assimilation and an expansive welfare state to bail them out should they fail to contribute positively to this country. So the racism there is very overt, but someone leaked part of it, so I want to get into it more. We've already read part of it. So here are some eye-popping sections of the literature, so under the immigration section. So part of what I've already read, but then it goes on to say, while certain economic and financial interest groups benefit immensely from mass immigration, legal as well as illegal, and the aggregate output of the country increases, the reality of large segments of the society, as well as the long-term existential future of America as a unique country of a unique culture and a unique identity, is being put at unnecessary risk, is something our leaders cannot afford to ignore. So under the infrastructure section, we'll work towards an infrastructure that reflects architectural, engineering and aesthetic value that befits the progeny of European architecture, whereby public infrastructure must be utilitarian as well as stunningly classically beautiful, befitting a world, power, and a source of freedom. Now, there's so much inherent irony in that they're using Anglo-Saxon traditions and political identity and then using it to be extremely anti-immigrant, because it's even in the word Anglo-Saxon. The Saxons were not from the British Isles, they came from Germany, and they took over as like the political elite, and they became a massive, ethnic group in Britain and England at the time. But again, they were immigrants to start with, they're not native to the British Isles, so it's very, very ironic and pretty funny to me that you're using a term like Anglo-Saxon while pushing real xenophobic rhetoric. And aren't these America First guys like massive patriots? Like, why are you trying to import like ancient English culture and talk about their political traditions? But if you know the first thing about the Anglo-Saxons and the politics of them and, the hierarchy of them and everything, it's not like they gave us democracy or freedom. Like, it's a real weird thing to talk about the political traditions of the Anglo-Saxons. And even if we're talking about religion at the time, people like Alfred the Great, not as like austere and Puritan as a lot of the Christians that settled America. He wanted to translate the Bible into Old English, and after Alfred the Great's time, translating the Bible literally like caused wars. There's something called the Hussite Rebellion in Bohemia, where these Czech people wanted to translate the Bible, inspired by John Wycliffe, who was an English guy in the 1300s who did translate the Bible into English to help just, your average layman who could read the Bible, because at this time, the only people who could read the Bible were monks and priests and the aristocracy. But this whole issue to me just shows that you either have to push revisionist history, and we're going to get into that, about the Saxons and the Anglo-Saxons, or you just do not understand what they are, and it's just a racist dog whistle for white Protestant. Now, there's a good passage I was reading from a book, and I want to share it with you guys, and it's called The Origins of Racial Anglo-Saxonism in Great Britain Before 1850. So this isn't anything new, and it happened in Britain as well, where Anglo-Saxonism stopped meaning like Alfred the Great and Athelstan, the first real king of England, who were Saxons, and started meaning something very exclusionary, where you just put certain people on a pedestal as these are like the superior race, and these people are the owners of Europe or the owners of England. So just want to read this for you quick. So by Reginald Horsman, although a belief in Anglo-Saxon racial superiority was a vital ingredient in English and American thought of the 19th century, the study of this belief has been largely neglected by historians. The best work is that of L.P. Curtis, who in studying anti-Irish prejudice in the second half of the 19th century has analysed far broader aspects of Anglo-Saxonism. Curtis points out that this Anglo-Saxonism of the middle and late 19th century was far different from the earlier 16th and 17th century adulation of the Anglo-Saxon period as a golden age of free institutions. A belief in Anglo-Saxons' freedom, once used to defend popular liberties, had by the middle of the 19th century been transformed into a rationale for the domination of peoples throughout the world. The heyday of Anglo-Saxonism came in the late 19th century, but the essential transformation had occurred earlier. Although Curtis has effectively analysed aspects of Anglo-Saxonism in the last half of the 19th century, little detailed attention has been devoted to the process by which earlier stress on Anglo-Saxon liberties was by 1850 transformed into a racist doctrine. The myth of Anglo-Saxon England had its origins in the 16th century. The break with Rome and the creation of an English church stimulated an interest in the primitive Anglo-Saxon church. Reformers wished to demonstrate that England was merely returning to older, purer religious practices dating from before the Norman conquest, practices which had been lost in subsequent centuries. Now that is pretty interesting, talking about how this vision of Anglo-Saxon England just changed throughout the centuries. And he's talking about there is when Henry VIII built the Church of England, and England essentially became Protestant, and some people saw that as Henry VIII taking it back to Alfred the Great's time, where the English church was more independent. But he talks about anti-Irish racism there, and like I said, a lot of fascist and far-right people believe in this Anglo-Saxon thing because Anglo-Saxon culture and English culture at the time was a mixture of Old English, German peoples and other peoples from like the Netherlands, of course people from Norway and Denmark, and it's not surprising this sort of groups are seen as, you know, old Nazis like Nazi Germany, as, you know, the pure races of Europe and the masters of Europe as well. Hitler actually often described the English as the Anglo-Saxons, talking about their shared connection there, because it's English and it's Germany mixed together, and that's the roots of England. Now, also talking about the break with Rome is very interesting, because at this time was the development of, in my mind, contemporary racism. And what happened was the Protestants, who were primarily pretty pale white people, spun racism the Spanish and the Italians used to push on Muslims or Jews who had converted to Christianity. So they basically said, although you've converted, because of your background and your blood, you're not actually Christians. Well, the Protestants spun that around and said, well, Italians and Spanish, you're quite dark. You know, your features are quite dark. People have been racist to me, weirdly enough, Nazis, because I have dark eyes and dark hair. And they said, you must have Muslim blood in you, Arab blood, so you're not real Christians. Whereas these white Anglo-Saxon Protestants were pure Christians, were pure white. And that's why it was used in an American context to be anti-Italian, anti-Spanish, anti-Irish as well, because these guys were seen as like the true Christians. So it's always had a massive racial connotation. Now, I was thinking in my mind, did anyone sign up to this who may be Italian, who may be, you know, Irish or Spanish? And I was looking at the people who had signed on to this, and there were names like Gaetz, there were names like Greene, names like, I think, Gomer's another one, and Gossar. And I looked up all these names. Nearly all of them are from England or Germany, and I think Gossar might be from Slovenia, that name and stuff. So I don't think any people in this American First Caucus were from backgrounds outside of maybe Central Europe and England, especially in terms of their names. So I found that very telling, because it was explicitly racist, but these guys also feel like they have some sort of connection to the Anglo-Saxons and English people in Germany. But that's the sort of history of this term being racialized and very exclusionary just for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, no one else. And these guys are racially superior for the reasons I outlined. Now I want to talk about how just this image of the Anglo-Saxons being like pure white Christians and everything is really ridiculous, and even thinking these guys weren't diverse at all. But what gets more ridiculous is that the Anglo-Saxon dominance of England ended essentially in 1066 to 1071 when the Normans from France invaded. So I want to get into the history of that. So Anglo-Saxons, you guys might know from games like Assassin's Creed and, you know, series like Vikings, because you have prominent Saxon figures in that, including King Aela, King Ecgbert, King Alfred the Great, and many others. Now, the Saxons came to the British Isles following the Roman Empire essentially leaving Britain behind. And there's various theories about how this sort of took place. I want to read some stuff to you. So there's one theory that the Saxons came in and basically saw this power vacuum in the elite of England and decided they would replace the Romans essentially as the rulers of the British Isles. So a good article called Who Do the English Think They Are by Razib Khan said the massive movement of people from Old Saxony apparently was triggered in 407 AD, the year in which the ailing Roman Empire withdrew much of its army from Britain. This left the island unprotected, an opportunity that the starving people on the continent couldn't pass up. Angles, Saxons and Jutes left their mound dwellings and broad bean fields in the wetlands of northern Europe in droves. Entire family clans set out to sea, usually in spring and summer when the water was calm. Their ships were bulging with household goods, cows and horses. According to the old chronicle, the land of the Angles was soon abandoned. Hark speculates that a steady stream of adventurers left the mainland between 450 and 550. Nevertheless, there are still inconsistencies. The estimated 200,000 intruders faced an overwhelming number of Britons, about 1 million, and yet the invaders triumphed. The kingdoms that soon developed, like East Anglia, Wessex and Essex, were run by robust chieftains. Now, there's also an interesting element to this, which may play into the racism and why racists and far-rightists like this stuff, is that there's a theory that the Saxons had a type of apartheid they'd set up when they came over to England. So the article goes on to say, In truth, however, the army of the Britons was usually in retreat. Many fell into captivity. According to Hark, the captured Britons lived a miserable existence as servants and maids in the villages of the Anglo-Saxons. There were two types of grave in the cemetery at the time, those containing swords and other weapons, and those with none. The local inhabitants, deprived of their rights, were apparently buried in the latter type of grave. The London geneticist Mark Thomas is convinced that the conquerors from the continent maintained social structures similar to apartheid, a view supported by the laws of King Greene of Wessex. They specify 6 social levels for the Britons, 5 of which refer to slaves. As a result of the brutal subjugation, the reproduction rate of the losing Britons was apparently curbed, while the winners had many children. The consequences are still evident today in the British gene pool. People from rural England more closely related to Northern Germans than to their countrymen from Wales or Scotland. Now, I also read something interesting, that the Saxon conquest of England used to also be compared to Manifest Destiny in America, because what you have is Christians coming over to England and essentially conquering native peoples and pagan peoples and bringing Christianity to them. And of course, Manifest Destiny was also looked on positively by Nazi Germany, who wanted to replicate that in Eastern Europe. But the apartheid Manifest Destiny angle is interesting when we're thinking about why the far right like this stuff. But why it is totally ridiculous to even talk about Anglo-Saxons and talk about the traditions is that the Anglo-Saxons were essentially wiped out of political leadership and eventually became assimilated by other ethnic groups, because in 1066, the last Saxon king lost a decisive battle against the Normans under William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 is something every British child will learn about in school. I learned about it when I was about 11. Everyone learns about this. And while the grandchild of Alfred the Great, Athelstan, is seen as like the first English king, William the Conqueror is often seen as like the first proper English king. And yeah, he won against the Saxons and then he beat the Vikings. And by about the 1070s, most of England was under Norman occupation. Now, the Normans were a sort of dynasty established by Rollo, the Viking, who inspired the character Rollo in the series Vikings, but they're not the same person. But it mixed with the local Gallic and French populations and created this new ethnicity, which conquered England. And of course, once they conquered England, loads of Normans came to settle England, went on to settle places like Ireland. And as time went on, people being able to trace their ancestry back to the Saxons got more and more slim. And I expect most people today in England, no matter how many generations your family have lived here, cannot trace your ancestry back to the Saxons unless you're one of those super wealthy people who have been in the landed aristocracy for like 1,000 years. There's a couple politicians who can trace their ancestry back to the 1200s. So I assume the people like that can maybe trace their ancestry back to the Anglo-Saxons. But because of the Norman conquest and because they completely changed the face of England, it would be very hard for anyone to really claim to be the descendant of Saxons. Not to mention that even during Saxon Britain and Saxon England, that there were still loads of diverse groups. If you watch the show Vikings, you will know the Kingdom of Wessex was one of the main holdouts as the Vikings completely conquered most of England. So think about, how much mixing goes on there. And just to even talk about being Anglo-Saxon is totally ridiculous in this day and age, because not only were they consistently killed and conquered by the Vikings, eventually their rule was completely stamped out by the Normans. So again, it's a very weird tradition to talk about. And the Normans, in terms of their Christianity and Catholicism, they weren't the same as the Saxons. So it seems very odd to talk about a people 1,000 years ago and England being conquered by another ethnicity and population of peoples. It's just very strange. And of course, in the American context, it has just become a racist dog whistle, and it relies on revisionist history of the Anglo-Saxons. And it is basically a broad brush where you will paint, I guess, Central Europeans and English people as true white Christians. Now, I read a really good article which makes the distinction between the English use of the term and the American use of the term, and how the American use has essentially always been a racist dog whistle, whereas English people used to racialise it a lot, but in contemporary England, it isn't really used as a racist dog whistle really too much. I've heard it once on the radio where a woman was describing herself as Anglo-Saxon, but she seems very old-fashioned and very old. I think these days, no one under 80 will be describing themselves as Anglo-Saxon, where a lot of Americans still want to do it. So History Extra wrote a really good article, by Michael Wood. As a racism row rumbles on, is it time to retire the term Anglo-Saxon? Now, like I said at the beginning of the video, there's been big controversy about Anglo-Saxon history as an academic field essentially being used to push racism because it went hand in hand with the racialization of the term. So the article is very good at outlining this, but American critics of Anglo-Saxon studies feel that the subject is by definition racist, that it never escaped its roots in the 18th and 19th century colonialism, when Anglo-Saxonism in both the USA and Britain was used to endorse white supremacy. So we spoke about that a bit earlier. The slave-owning Thomas Jefferson, after all, founded the Republic on imagined Anglo-Saxon roots based on law supposedly lost in 1066 with the Norman conquest. This latter-day Anglo-Saxon Commonwealth would come to be summed up in the acronym WASP, White, Anglo-Saxon and Protestant, a code for racial purity that white supremacists and neo-Nazis have embraced. And this situation, critics allege, is still implicitly underwritten by a white academic establishment that has failed to move with the times and embrace diversity, both in appointments and ideas. Some US medievalists believe we have already reached a point where reclaiming Anglo-Saxon is not possible. Dr. Mary Rabaran Ulm says that it's not about taking back the term, we have lost it, and for students of colour in medieval studies, the term carries racist connotations that don't represent who they are. So the racist understanding of the term Anglo-Saxon as defining white Anglo-Americans has a long history and is now pervasive among certain groups, says Dr. Adam Miyashiro, Assistant Professor of Literature at Stockton University, New Jersey. And he pointed it out in an open letter that really began the current conversation. He even cites an Aryan nation prison gang in the US which built a religion called Theodism around the heroic poem Beowulf. That is the crazier end of white supremacy, but the view of American scholar and author Mary Dockeray Miller, the issue goes right to the core of the settler colonial white supremacist ideology. Outside the university, the phrase Anglo-Saxon did not refer to the early medieval English. It was a racial and racist, frightened with assumptions of privilege and superiority. The cultural rhetoric of Manifest Destiny specifically defined Anglo-Saxons as superior to the enslaved and free Africans, Native Americans, Mexicans, and numerous other groups defined as non-white, including Irish and Italian immigrants. We spoke about this a bit earlier. The titles of college courses in Anglo-Saxons also carried these racial connotations and cultural associations. So it goes on to talk about the British version of this, so British exasperation. So is it another case of two nations divided by a single language? Is it a controversy rooted in the very circumstances of the founding of the American Republic and the cultural ideas that still underpin it? Some British scholars are exasperated by what they see as a US problem, centred on literature, as opposed to its history, archaeology and material culture. One told me, there seems to be little willingness to acknowledge the fact that these terms are used differently in the UK than in the US. In the UK, they're used in common parlance to describe the period and the people who lived in what would become the Kingdom of England between the end of Roman Britain and the Norman conquest, simply as labels to describe a historical time period. That's true, of course, and as such the term is embedded in the national curriculum for Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, which all school pupils in England follow. And it is probably fair to say that the story of Anglo-Saxon England as taught today is about diversity. In UK universities, this certainly has been the view since the late 60s, when I was a student. We were influenced by the Marxist school of history of Rodney Hilton, Christopher Hill and E.P. Thompson. For us, the racist views of E.A. Freeman were a Victorian ideology that needed analysis, but rested on pure fantasy. And to my knowledge, doing outreach today in schools, they play no role in the current broad understanding of the period. So I just wanted to end this little bit on this segment of the article which I liked, talking about the diversity of the time. In the 10th century, King Athelstan's courts, he's the first king of England, were attended by people from at least 4 different British language traditions, alongside people who spoke 4 major Old English dialect groups and 2 Scandinavian languages. They were joined by scholars and visitors from Francia, Germany and Ireland. No wonder that the 10th century monk Wulfstan Cantor observed that England was a land of many different languages and customs, Their world was multilingual and they were well aware that their culture consisted of many strands, Latin, Hebrew, Greek, and as the English scholar Alcian put it, the light that came from Africa, the Libyan Hadrian, a man of African race, alongside the Syrian Theodore, is the most important figure in the history of English education. So like with most fascist and far-right leaning versions of history, it has to be revisionist. It has to ignore the diversity of the time. Like this article ended with, England was extremely diverse, and even if we're just looking at the English populations themselves, and I did a module on King Alfred and Old English and him trying to Christianise various Cornish pagans in Cornwall, and when you look at that period of history, whether it's the Britons or the Picts or the Irish or the Saxons or, various old Roman groups and Celts, it's, so clear this period is very, diverse. And even when the Saxons ruled, it was diverse because you still had the influence of all these groups, including settlers from Scandinavia as well. And like I outlined earlier, the term had been consistently racialized throughout the last 500 years to essentially push white supremacy. And that can go back to like the 1500s and the 1600s, where it was used against groups like the Irish, Italians, and Spanish, to 1800s America, where the white immigrants from Germany and England would call themselves, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, where people like Irish and Italians were lesser than you. They weren't actually white. They had too much influences in their blood from Muslims and Arab populations and stuff like that. And then today, it's pretty clear with the people pushing this Anglo-Saxon stuff in Congress, these people do see themselves as descendants from this tradition, because them using this to push xenophobia just shows they don't understand Anglo-Saxon history and they're just subscribing to the racist use of the term. And like I said, Great Gatsby is a book that analyses this, but loads of books have. And loads of books have analysed these WASP groups in the US and how they have this white supremacist ideology. And it's not surprising, even people like Adolf Hitler would talk about the Anglo-Saxons when he was talking about the shared history between Germany and England. But it's a very interesting topic, and I think it goes hand in hand with much of the content I've made on my channel, where white supremacists who idealize dead countries or dead states have to have a revisionist history of it, because the real history would never fit in with their white supremacist ideology, only their interpretation, which ignores most of the facts, and that is what this American First Caucus were doing. So anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Please, no spoilers for Vikings in the comments, because I'm only on season 2, although I have completed Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which takes place like after Vikings, so I do know, most of the major deaths and everything. But if you like my content, consider supporting it on Patreon. Help me get new chocolate oranges. If you want to follow me on social media, at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram. Come join our communities on Discord and my subreddit. That's all in the description. And subscribe to my second channel. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.